The headlights of our SUV cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow strip of road winding between dense forests. I sat in the passenger seat, glancing at Sheriff Tom Wilson, who was intently focused on driving. We were heading to Sam Harrison's farm. Another call, another mystery to solve. The bodies of mutilated animals had been found in the area for several weeks, but tonight, it felt like something had changed. The sheriff was grim, which in itself was a bad sign. "Jake, have you ever been to Harrison's farm?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the road. "A couple of times," I replied, trying not to reveal my anxiety. "Sam's a good man. I can't understand who would want to harm his livestock." Tom nodded, continuing to drive down the winding road. We left behind the cozy homes of Elm Ridge and were now delving into the forest surrounding our small town. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching our every move. Sam's farm was on the very edge of town, where civilization met the wild. We drove a few more miles before the headlights lit up an old wooden sign that read Harrison's Farm. The road became even rougher here, causing the car to shake and vibrate. Tom turned the wheel sharply, and we veered onto a narrow dirt road. As we approached the farm, a sense of foreboding washed over me. The large barn door was wide open, and the moonlight illuminated the field where the cows once grazed. Now it was littered with the torn bodies of animals. Blood glistened on the grass, like a black mirror reflecting the moonlight. "Damn," Tom whispered, staring at the scene. We got out of the car, and I felt the cold night air seep into my bones. The scent of death lingered in the air. Sam came out to meet us, his face pale and tense. "They came again," he said in a hoarse voice. "This is the third night in a row. At first, I only heard strange noises, but last night..." He trailed off, looking at us with despair in his eyes. "Tell us what happened," the sheriff gently urged, trying to calm the man. Sam sighed and began his story. "I went to bed as usual, but in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. The cows were mooing so desperately it seemed like they had seen the devil himself. I headed to the pen where the noise was coming from and saw something or someone tearing my animals apart. And that sound, the tearing flesh and the wheezing, it almost drove me insane. I saw a shadow, big and unnatural. I couldn't make it out clearly, but I fired a shot. It ran away, but I was scared out of my wits." We nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. "You did the right thing, Sam," Tom said. "Let's take a look at where this happened." We walked to the barn, trying not to step on the torn bodies. The night was quiet, only the wind rustling the leaves of the trees. But there was something sinister in this silence, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation. On the ground, amidst the manure and dirt, we found tracks. They looked like wolf prints, but were significantly larger. "This isn't an ordinary wolf," I muttered, examining the paw prints. Tom bent down for a closer look. "Yeah, something much bigger." Sam stood nearby, trembling from the cold and fear. "I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous. My wife is afraid to leave the house. Please help me." "We'll figure it out, Sam. I promise," I said, trying to conceal the internal shiver. The sheriff directed his flashlight at the barn, and we moved closer, inspecting the doorways and walls. Bloodstains on the ground told their own story. We saw claw marks on the wooden boards, as if someone or something had tried to break in. "Damn, Jake, look at this," Tom whispered, pointing at the deep scratches. "What kind of creature is this?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. We continued the inspection, trying not to miss any details. The beams of our flashlights revealed tufts of fur, drops of blood, and deep paw prints leading to the forest. Each step was difficult. The ground was wet and sticky from blood and recent rain. When we reached the edge of the forest, I noticed a shadow flitting between the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it was something more. "Hey, stop!" the sheriff shouted, directing his flashlight toward the shadow. The figure froze for a moment, then swiftly disappeared into the depths of the forest. We exchanged glances and rushed after it, trying not to lose sight. The forest surrounded us on all sides, the trees standing like grim sentinels, hiding their secrets. We moved cautiously, trying not to make unnecessary noise, but every step echoed in the night's silence. Branches cracked underfoot, and every sound made us startle. "Do you see anything?" I whispered, peering into the darkness. "No, but it's here somewhere," Tom replied, his voice low and anxious. Suddenly, we saw something run between the trees. Aiming our flashlights, we noticed it was a person, dressed in a long cloak and white gloves. Their face was hidden by a huge animal skull with deer antlers worn as a mask. "Stop! Sheriff's Department!" Tom shouted, but the figure didn't stop. We chased after it, trying to keep up, but the night and the dense forest had their way. The figure was quick and agile, and soon it disappeared into the darkness. We stopped, panting, and looked around, trying to find any trace. "Damn!" Tom swore, peering into the darkness. "We lost him." "What was that?" I asked, still not believing my eyes. "I don't know, but it's definitely not a wolf," Tom replied. "Maybe some kind of lunatic." We continued our search, the beams of our flashlights sliding over the trees, illuminating every branch and bush. We listened to the night sounds, trying to catch the faintest rustle, but the forest seemed to hold its breath, hiding our answers in its depths. After a while, it became clear we wouldn't find any traces of the mysterious stranger. "Jake, there's nothing more here," Tom muttered, disappointedly lowering his flashlight. "He's gone." We turned back, returning to Sam Harrison's farm. There, in the moonlit field, we saw the devastation left by the mysterious creature again. We slowly approached the torn animal bodies, trying to find new clues. "Let's inspect this place one more time," I suggested, directing my flashlight at the ground. We examined every corner of the farm, carefully studying the tracks on the ground, the scratches on the barn walls, and the drops of blood scattered everywhere. The flashlights revealed horrific details: tufts of fur, deep wounds on the animal bodies, and those strange, overly large tracks that still puzzled us. "This couldn't have been an ordinary animal," I said, examining one of the tracks. "I agree," Tom replied, frowning. "We're missing something." We retraced our steps over and over, but found nothing new. Sam stood nearby, his face tense, eyes glistening with fear and exhaustion. "We'll do everything we can, Sam," Tom assured him. "But we need more information. If anything else happens, call us right away." Sam nodded, looking at us gratefully. "Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jake." As we returned to the car, I felt exhaustion weigh heavily on me. My mind was filled with questions that had no answers yet. Tom got behind the wheel and we drove back to town. The road home felt longer and gloomier than before. We remained silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. I couldn't get the image of that person in the cloak with the animal skull on their head out of my mind. Who were they? and what was their connection to these horrible events? When we finally reached town, I felt a sense of relief. The warm light of the street lamps and the familiar outlines of the houses seemed comforting after the grim forest and the sinister farm. "We'll continue the investigation first thing in the morning," Tom said, stopping the car in front of my house. "Yes, Tom. Tomorrow," I replied, getting out of the car. I stood on my doorstep, watching the sheriff drive away. The night was quiet, but I knew that somewhere out there in the darkness lurked something terrible and sinister. I went inside, trying to calm myself and focus on the next day. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my heart. The night had left many questions and few answers. After a quick breakfast, I headed to the station, where my usual deputy sheriff duties awaited me. The day began as usual. Reports, calls, a few minor incidents that needed to be investigated. But the thoughts of the previous night's events wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I looked at the crime scene photos or reread witness statements, the image of that person in the cloak with the skull on their head resurfaced. By noon, I felt the need for a change of scenery when the phone rang. I looked at the display and saw the name of my younger sister, Lily. "Jake, can you come over for lunch?" Her voice sounded cheerful, but I detected a note of worry. "Lily, I have a lot of work," I began, but she interrupted me. "Please, Jake, Dad will be home too, and I miss you." Her words made me pause. My father and I hadn't gotten along for a long time. Our relationship was strained, but Lily was dear to me. "All right, Lily, I'll come," I agreed, sighing. She was thrilled, thanked me, and hung up. Getting into my old pickup truck, I left the station and headed to my father's house. The road led through the entire town, past familiar places and faces. Elm Ridge was a small town, and everyone knew each other here. People greeted me, some stopped to ask about the investigation, but I just nodded politely and continued on my way. My father's mansion, the mayor's house, stood on a hill on the outskirts of Elm Ridge. A majestic house with tall windows and a well-kept garden surrounded by an iron fence. It symbolized power and status. I parked at the massive gates and got out of the truck. Lily met me at the door, her face lighting up with a joyful smile. "Jake, finally you're here!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me. I picked her up and spun her around, feeling the fatigue and anxiety fade away. "Hey, kiddo, how are you?" I asked, setting her back on the ground. "All good. Dad's waiting for us in the kitchen," she said, grabbing my hand and leading me inside the house. When I entered, Dad was already setting the table. His face looked tired, but he tried not to show it. "Have a seat, Jake," he said, smiling. But I saw the same wariness in his eyes as always. I sat down, looking around at the familiar surroundings. I had grown up in this house and it always felt safe. But now, in light of recent events, something had changed. I felt that difficult conversations and possibly more unanswered questions lay ahead. "Did something happen, Lily?" I asked when Dad left to bring the remaining dishes from the kitchen. She looked at me, her eyes full of care and worry. "I just want us to be together, like before," she said quietly. I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness. Dad returned with the food, and we started eating in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The tension between us was palpable, but for Lily's sake I tried to be patient. After Mom died 10 years ago, Dad changed a lot. Our relationship deteriorated, and I understood him less and less. We became almost strangers. A few years ago, he suddenly decided to run for mayor, which seemed strange to me. He had been a scientist before, and I couldn't understand why he suddenly wanted to go into politics. Lunch passed in strained silence. Dad and I exchanged rare phrases, more focused on the food than on conversation. Lily tried to keep the conversation going, but even her attempts couldn't dispel the oppressive atmosphere. After lunch, Lily suggested we go for a walk, and I agreed to get some fresh air. We went out to the backyard, and I noticed something strange. There were fresh dirt tracks at the back entrance, and Dad's shoes, which were standing by the door, were covered in mud. I took note of it, but quickly forgot, caught up in the conversation. We walked through the garden with Lily talking about her school activities while I tried to listen, though my thoughts kept returning to the investigation. The walk was a pleasant distraction, but soon the sheriff called me. "Jake, you need to get to the Jefferson house right away," he said on the phone. "There's been an incident." I said goodbye to my sister, promising to return soon, and headed to my truck. As I got behind the wheel, tension gripped me again. The drive was short, but I went through all the possible scenarios in my head. When I arrived at the house, the sheriff met me with a serious expression on his face. "What happened?" I asked, getting out of the truck. "You'd better see for yourself," he said, nodding towards the house. We walked past the house and into the backyard, where a horrifying scene awaited us. On their knees on the grass were newlyweds, Jessica and Mark. Their faces were twisted with horror and grief. In front of them, on the grass, lay the torn bodies of their dogs. Blood glistened in the sun, and an ominous silence hung in the air. "Damn," I whispered, gritting my teeth in powerless anger. "When did this happen?" "Seems recent," the sheriff replied, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. Tom and I began examining the crime scene. I carefully studied the tracks while Tom searched for any clues that might help us understand what was happening. On the ground were paw prints, large, deep, clearly not those of an ordinary wolf. We followed them, and they led us to the forest. "Look," I pointed to the tracks that led into the forest. "I think we should check where they go." Tom nodded, and we stepped into the dense thicket. Each step was challenging, the ground covered with undergrowth, and branches snapped underfoot. An eerie silence hung around, and every rustle seemed like a harbinger of new danger. We followed the tracks and soon saw something that made us freeze. In the clearing ahead stood a creature resembling a wolf, but much larger and more terrifying. It stood listening, and its eyes gleamed in the twilight of the forest. "That's it," I whispered, feeling the adrenaline surge through me. "Don't make any sudden moves," the sheriff warned, slowly drawing his weapon. But the creature noticed us and bolted. "After it!" I shouted, chasing after it. We ran through the forest, trying not to lose sight of this horrific being. It moved quickly and deftly, leaping over fallen trees and bushes. Branches whipped at my face, but I ignored the pain, focused only on the pursuit. At some point, I lost sight of it, but then noticed movement ahead again. Tom was moving parallel, trying to corner the creature. "This way!" I shouted when I saw it turn left. We continued the chase, trying to trap it. But the creature was smart. It suddenly stopped, turned around, and charged at us. I fell, feeling it push me. Tom fired a shot, and the beast howled in pain, retreating. "Are you all right?" Tom asked, running over to me. "Yeah, but we need to catch it," I replied, getting to my feet. We resumed the chase, but the creature vanished into the night. "Damn it!" Tom cursed. "It got away!" We stood in the clearing, trying to catch our breath after the intense pursuit. Adrenaline was still pumping through our veins, and I tried to comprehend what kind of beast we had just encountered. We relaxed, thinking it had fled, and for a moment, We let our guard down. But suddenly, the creature burst out from behind the trees and leaped at us. Its eyes glowed with fury, and its bared fangs gleamed menacingly in the moonlight. "Watch out!" I yelled, but it was too late. The creature lunged at us with incredible speed. I managed to draw my gun and fire, but the beast still pounced on me, knocking me to the ground. I felt its sharp claws cut through my arm and screamed in pain. At that moment, Tom fired again, and the beast howled, retreating. The sheriff didn't waste time and continued shooting until the creature collapsed to the ground. I stood up, clutching my bleeding arm, and approached the beast's body. It was breathing heavily, its eyes filled with hatred and fear. We stood over it, and then something strange began to happen. The creature's body started to shake and distort. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, unable to believe his eyes. Before us, something unimaginable occurred. The beast began to transform. Claws and fangs disappeared, fur retracted back into the skin, and gradually a human figure emerged. Within moments, a bleeding man lay on the ground. I could barely believe my eyes. Lying before us was Jonathan Miller, a local farmer who had gone missing a few weeks ago. His eyes were half closed, his face contorted in pain. "Jonathan," I breathed, feeling a wave of shock wash over me. How is this possible? Tom stood beside me, his face pale, muttering something under his breath. "What the hell is this?" Jonathan tried to say something, but only a wheeze came out. He looked at us pleadingly, as if trying to explain something, but strength left him. I knelt beside him, trying to keep him conscious. "Jonathan, what happened?" I asked, feeling fear and confusion grip my heart. He just shook his head, his eyes beginning to dim. "Sorry, I didn't mean to," he whispered, and life left his body. We stood in the forest, stunned and bewildered. Before us lay a man who had been turned into a monster. I couldn't understand how this had happened or why. All I knew was that we were facing something far more terrifying than we could have imagined. I knelt and examined him. I noticed strange scars on his body and marks from injections that looked like the result of medical procedures. They were unnaturally precise, as if done in sterile conditions which didn't fit with his current state at all. "Damn it, Tom, look at this," I said, pointing at the scars. "What's going on here?" He nodded, his face pale and tense. He immediately took out his phone and called the local coroner, arranging for the body to be transported to the morgue for an autopsy. While we waited, I couldn't take my eyes off the body. Tom and I exchanged glances, understanding that this wasn't an ordinary murder. Soon the morgue vehicle arrived, and we helped load the body, trying not to pay attention to the driver's grim look. Back at the station, we filed a report on the incident. The superiors listened with skepticism, but when we presented photos and records, their doubts turned to concern. However, we decided not to disclose the information to avoid causing panic in the town. "Let people remain unaware until we figure this out," said the chief, wiping sweat from his forehead. In the evening, sitting in the office, Tom and I tried to connect the attacks to Jonathan's disappearance. "All these cases," I began, rubbing my temples, "seem connected. But how?" Tom thoughtfully looked at the map of the town, dotted with pins marking the attack locations. "Is there anything common between these cases? People, places, times?" As we sat, lost in thought and discussion, the phone suddenly rang. Tom picked it up, and his expression instantly tensed as he listened. I noticed how his face changed. "We're on our way," he said, and hung up, turning to me. "Jake, we've got a new call. A man reported something happening to his wife. The address is 47 Willow Street. We hurried to the car and drove off. Night had already fallen over Elm Ridge, and the town was shrouded in thick darkness. The road felt endlessly long, even though the house was only a few miles from the station. My mind was racing with thoughts of what might await us. When we arrived at the address, I saw a small house standing in the shadow of trees. The windows were dark, and the whole house looked ominous and abandoned. We got out of the car, lighting our way with flashlights, and headed to the front door. It was slightly ajar, and a deathly silence emanated from inside. We entered, moving cautiously down the hallway. Our flashlight beams picked out old furniture and dusty shelves from the darkness. It seemed like no one had lived here for a long time, which didn't match the man's report. "Where are they?" Tom whispered, looking around. Suddenly we heard a rustling in the next room. I signaled to Tom and we slowly approached the door. My heart was pounding and I struggled to stay calm. We entered and were met with a horrifying scene. 2 werewolves stood in the middle of the room, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight streaming through a broken window. They snarled, baring their sharp fangs, and it looked like they were about to pounce on us. "Tom, watch out!" I shouted, drawing my weapon. The fight began instantly. One of the werewolves charged at Tom, knocking him to the ground. The other lunged at me, and I barely managed to shoot, wounding it in the shoulder. The beast howled in pain but didn't retreat. I fired again, trying to keep them at bay. Tom, pinned under one of the creatures, struggled to break free. I rushed over and fired, making the beast back off. The other werewolf, seeing their chances diminishing, howled in rage and tried to escape the room. "Don't let them get away!" Tom shouted, getting up from the floor. I chased after them, but the werewolves were too fast. They jumped through the window and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the scent of blood and fear. We stood there, breathing heavily, looking around. The house fell silent again, but this time it was filled with the realization that the danger was still close. But then, I noticed movement at the edge of the forest through the window. In the moonlight, I saw the silhouette of a person in a cloak with a deer skull on their head. "Look, Tom! It's him!" I shouted, pointing at the figure. The person, as if sensing our attention, turned their head towards us. Their eyes glinted in the darkness, and they fled into the forest. "After him!" Tom barked, and we sprinted in pursuit. We ran out of the house and across the field, leaping over tall grass and bumps, trying not to fall behind. We burst into the forest, branches whipping our faces and arms, but we kept running. The person with the deer skull on their head flitted between the trees, sometimes disappearing from view and then reappearing ahead. "Don't fall behind, Jake!" Tom shouted, his voice tense. My lungs were burning, but I couldn't afford to stop. We followed him, trying not to lose sight. The forest around us seemed alive, sounds growing louder, and every shadowy movement reminded us of the unknown evil's presence. The person with the skull emerged from the darkness again, and I saw him turn left into a denser part of the forest. We sharply changed direction, and I began to feel the path becoming more winding and challenging. "Tom, he's leading us somewhere!" I shouted, realizing this wasn't just an escape. "Keep running," he replied. "We need to find out what he's hiding." We kept chasing him until we reached a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. The figure stood in the middle of the clearing, silhouetted clearly in the moonlight. He raised his hand as if beckoning us to stop. "What do you want?" Tom yelled, aiming his gun at him. The figure didn't respond, but gestured for us to follow. He turned slowly and began moving towards a shadowy entrance, either a cave or an abandoned building. "What the hell?" I muttered, but I couldn't resist the curiosity and determination. Tom and I, weapons ready, followed him, feeling the darkness of the forest closing in around us. The figure with the deer skull led us deeper into the unknown, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this place held many secrets and dangers. Finally, we approached an old abandoned building, partially overgrown with moss and vines. The figure stopped at the door and gestured for us to enter. "Be ready," Tom whispered. The stranger entered the building first, his silhouette blending into the dim light. We cautiously followed him, but as soon as we stepped inside, he vanished as if he had melted into the air. "Where did he go?" I whispered, peering into the darkness. "I don't know, but stay alert," Tom replied, keeping his gun ready. We started exploring the building, which turned out to be an old, abandoned laboratory. The walls were covered in cobwebs, the floors littered with debris and old equipment. The air smelled of damp and decay. The laboratory tables were cluttered with dusty flasks and test tubes, as if no one had been here for a long time. Suddenly I noticed strange tracks on the floor, as if something had been dragged. They looked fresh, as if someone had recently left them here. We followed them, and they led us to the back of the laboratory. There, we found a door. It was slightly ajar, and light was coming from inside, which seemed odd considering how abandoned the laboratory looked. "I think we should check this out," Tom said, cautiously pushing the door open wider. We entered and found ourselves in another, more modern laboratory. Everything here looked as if it had been recently used. The floors were clean, the equipment looked newer, and the lighting was dim but functional. The laboratory tables were lined with modern instruments, computers, and chemical reagents. Diagrams and charts hung on the walls, most of which concerned genetic research and experiments. "Damn, Jake," Tom whispered, looking around. "Someone is definitely continuing experiments here." I approached one of the tables and noticed records written in neat handwriting. They detailed DNA modifications and transformations. Horrible suspicions began to form in my mind. "Tom, look at this," I said, handing him the records. "This is all related to what happened to Jonathan and the others." We continued to explore the laboratory, finding more evidence that dangerous experiments had been conducted here. In one corner, I found a cabinet with medications and strange vials filled with liquids of various colors. "This place is a nightmare," Tom muttered. "But who is behind this?" As we continued to investigate the premises, Tom pointed to a massive steel cabinet standing against the far wall. Its doors were locked but looked old enough to be forced open. We exchanged glances, understanding that the cabinet might hold answers to our questions. "Let's try to open it," Tom suggested, and I nodded, grabbing the handle. With some effort, we finally managed to open the cabinet doors with a prolonged creak. Behind them, we discovered a hidden door that we hadn't noticed initially. The door was open. "Damn, what do you think is behind this door?" I whispered, feeling my heart race. The sheriff shrugged. We stepped into the dimly lit corridor, which led us deeper into the building. It was cleaner here, the air fresher, and the feeling of neglect was replaced by a sense of secret activity. At the end of the corridor, we came across a massive door with a porthole. Inside, there was muted light, and through the glass we could see a large room. We exchanged glances, realizing that something important might be hidden inside. "Ready?" Tom asked, and I nodded, summoning all my courage. We pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a large hall filled with various equipment. In the center of the hall stood a giant glass capsule filled with murky liquid. Through its walls, we could see a vague outline of a creature slowly moving inside the liquid. "What the hell is this?" Tom whispered, moving closer. I shone my flashlight on the capsule, and the creature inside became clearer. It resembled a wolf, huge with long claws and terrifying fangs. Its eyes were closed, and it seemed to be in a state of sleep or deep trance. We stood in horror, unable to believe our eyes. "How is this possible?" I muttered, feeling fear grip me. At the bottom of the capsule was a plaque. I leaned in to read the inscription, and my heart stopped. Engraved on the plaque was my mother's name. "No, this can't be," I whispered, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. "Jake, what does it say?" Tom asked, but I couldn't respond, still processing what I had seen. He looked at the plaque and his face turned pale. "Your mother? Was she a victim of these experiments?" I nodded, unable to speak. We turned our attention to a table next to the capsule, filled with notes and journals. I quickly grabbed one of the journals and began flipping through the pages. The entries were neatly written with diagrams and detailed descriptions of experiments. Genetic modification experiments. DNA transformations. I read aloud, feeling horror tighten around my heart. They used people as test subjects. The sheriff carefully studied the records, his face growing darker with each page he read. "Your mother, she was one of the first. They altered her DNA trying to create something new." We continued reading, delving into the nightmarish details of the experiments. Horrible procedures, injections of unknown substances, transformations that turned people into monsters. "This is madness," Tom muttered, throwing the records onto the table. "What kind of person could do something like this?" I stood, clutching the journal, feeling a wave of anger and despair wash over me. These people had ruined my mother's life, turning her into a monster. And now these experiments were continuing, spreading chaos and death in our town. I hadn't yet processed everything I had seen when Tom called me over. He had noticed another door in the far wall, less obvious, hidden behind shelves of scientific equipment. "There might be more behind this," Tom murmured, heading for the door. We approached and struggled to move the shelves, clearing the way. The door was locked. Tom quickly dealt with the lock, and we cautiously stepped inside. We found ourselves in a narrow corridor, lit by dim, flickering lamps. We walked forward slowly, feeling the walls close in around us. With each step, the tension grew, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were approaching something important. "This corridor is too long," I whispered, looking around. "I agree," Tom replied, his voice echoing around us. Finally, we reached the end of the corridor and stood before a massive door, much more modern and secure than the others. Tom carefully opened it, and we stepped into a spacious room. At first glance, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Looking around, I realized this was my father's office. The setting was painfully familiar. An old desk with neatly arranged papers, bookshelves filled with scientific works, and a large leather chair. "This can't be," I whispered, feeling my head spin. How could his office be here? "Are you sure?" Tom asked, also examining the room. "Maybe it's just a coincidence?" "No, Tom," I replied, approaching the desk and picking up one of the photographs. It was of me, my sister Lily, and my father, taken many years ago. This is definitely his office, but how is he connected to all this? Suddenly it hit me. My father was a scientist, I began, piecing the puzzle together in my mind, but I never thought he could be involved in something like this. Tom listened carefully, then suggested, "We should search the house. Maybe we'll find some clues." We began searching the room, turning over every book, examining every document. But despite our efforts, we found nothing concrete about his involvement in the experiments. The only thing clear was that the office had been left in a hurry. "Where could he be?" the sheriff muttered when we finished searching. "And where is Lily?" I added. We exchanged glances, realizing the seriousness of the situation. "We need to get back to the lab," I said. "Maybe we'll find more answers there." When we returned, the first thing we noticed was movement in the corner of the room. The beams of our flashlights illuminated the figure in a cloak and deer skull mask. "Hey, stop!" Tom shouted, aiming his gun at the figure. I followed his lead, feeling my heart race. The person froze, raising their hands as if surrendering. We slowly approached, weapons ready. Tom yanked the skull off his head, and we both froze in horror. Standing before us was a man whose face was scarred and disfigured. It looked like something between human and wolf. His eyes were filled with pain and desperation. His skin covered in scars and marks from failed surgeries. He looked like a living testament to a failed experiment. "What happened to you?" Tom asked, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "Did my father do this?" I added, feeling horror and rage mix within me. The man slowly lowered his hands and spoke in a raspy voice. "Yes, your father. He kidnapped me years ago. I was an ordinary farmer, but he chose me for his experiments. He wanted to create the perfect being by combining human and wolf DNA. But something went wrong. I was left like this. A freak." We exchanged glances with Tom, realizing the horrible truth. The man continued his story, his voice trembling with pain and anger. "I tried to escape, and I did. But I knew I couldn't just return to normal life. My face, I became an outcast. I hid in the woods, trying to survive. And all this time I thought of only one thing: revenge on your father. He ruined my life, turned me into a monster." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Tom asked, his voice filled with compassion. "Your father is the mayor," the man replied bitterly. "He has connections. He did everything to hide his experiments. And who would believe a freak claiming the town's mayor is a mad scientist? I tried to warn others, but people were afraid of me and no one listened. The only thing I could do was scare people and try to draw attention to what was happening." We stood, stunned by his story. I felt a wave of rage wash over me. My father, a man I trusted, had turned out to be a monster capable of such horrors. The man suddenly looked at his watch, and his eyes widened in alarm. "Morning is approaching," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "Today your father has gathered all the townspeople for an important announcement. He's planning something, I know it. We must act immediately." We realized that time was running out. "We need to go," I told Tom, and he nodded. We quickly led the man out of the lab and headed for the exit. As we moved through the corridor, we kept him between us to ensure he wouldn't escape. When we emerged from the building, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, illuminating the grim forest. "Quick to the car," Tom ordered, and we hurried to our SUV. The man sat in the back seat, and Tom and I took our places in the front. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the winding road leading to the town center. My mind was racing with thoughts, but I knew one thing. We had to stop whatever my father had planned. "What could he be announcing?" I asked, turning to our captive. "I'm not sure," he replied, his voice shaking. "But he's always planning something. Maybe he's going to make another statement about the town's safety or his new initiatives, but I'm sure there's more behind it." We sped down the road, and with each mile, the feeling of anxiety grew stronger. Soon we reached the town center. People were already gathering in the square, many looking sleepy but curious. A stage was set up, and my father, dressed in his official suit, was preparing to speak. "We need to act quickly," Tom said, getting out of the car. "We can't let him talk." We hurried toward the stage, drawing the eyes of the townspeople. Some recognized us, and I saw confusion and concern in their eyes. We led our captive with us, his face hidden by a hood. "Tom, Jake, what's going on?" one of our colleagues asked, approaching us. "We need backup," Tom replied. "We have to arrest the mayor. Right now." Our colleague looked at us, then at the stage, and his eyes widened in understanding. "Got it. I'll inform the others." We continued toward the stage, and I saw my father preparing to start his speech. The crowd was silent, waiting. I felt adrenaline surge through me and quickened my pace. "Father," I shouted, stepping onto the stage, "you need to stop this right now." He turned to me, his face showing surprise and irritation. "Jake, what are you doing? This is an important announcement for the town." "No, you need to stop," I said, my hand resting on my pistol. "We know all about your experiments. Your crimes will be exposed." The crowd began to murmur, people looking at us with confusion and fear. My father glanced quickly at the disfigured man we had brought with us, and his face paled. "What have you done, Father?" I asked, feeling anger and disappointment merge into one. "This man is your victim." My father tried to compose himself and said, looking at the crowd, "It's all lies. This man is a criminal and they are trying to slander me." "No," Tom said firmly, stepping onto the stage. "We have evidence. We know all about your experiments, and we won't let you continue." At that moment, our colleagues arrived at the stage, surrounding it, and began to arrest my father. The people in the crowd were shocked and didn't understand what was happening. My father, desperately resisting arrest, screamed, "It was to save your mother." I stopped, stunned, and looked at him. "What did you say?" Realizing he had nothing left to lose, my father spoke, his voice filled with bitterness and despair. "She was in a terrible accident. She was dying, and I couldn't let that happen. I loved her more than anything. I used my old research, my experiments to save her. I couldn't let her die." I was dumbfounded. Everything he had done, all the evil he had committed, was to save my mother. But why didn't he stop? Why didn't he find another way? "You turned her into a monster," I said, feeling the anger surge again. "And you continued your experiments, ruining others' lives." "I tried to save her!" he yelled, tears streaming down his face. "But everything went wrong. She was the one I loved. I tried to fix my mistakes, but it only made things worse. I couldn't stop." Suddenly, screams erupted, and we turned. Several werewolves had burst into the square, their eyes glowing with fury, their fangs bared in a terrifying snarl. But instead of attacking, they surrounded the crowd, emitting ominous, prolonged howls. "They're here!" Tom shouted, drawing his pistol. The crowd plunged into chaos and panic. People screamed, trying to flee, but the werewolves didn't attack. They just stood around, continuing to howl as if obeying some sinister command. "What are they doing?" I whispered, feeling my heart pound in my chest. "I don't know, but it's strange," Tom replied, his pistol at the ready. "They're not attacking, just surrounding us." At that moment, my father, standing on the stage, yelled, "It's too late! I couldn't save your mother, but I accidentally infected all the townspeople." His words struck like a thunderbolt. "What did you say?" I exclaimed, not believing my ears. "I tried to find a way to cure her, but the experiment got out of control," he cried, his face twisted in agony. "I accidentally released a virus, and it infected everyone in the town. Any of you could become like them." Suddenly, my father began to tremble, his face contorted with pain. His body started to change right before our eyes. His skin began to sprout thick fur, bones cracked and shifted, transforming him into something horrific. "What's happening to him?" I screamed, feeling horror wash over me. But he wasn't the only one. People in the square also started to transform. They screamed as their bodies twisted and deformed, turning into half-wolf monstrosities. The crowd panicked. People tried to run, but they couldn't escape the changes happening in their bodies. "I don't know what to do," Tom shouted, his voice filled with fear and despair. "We need to run." But before we could do anything, Tom himself began to transform. His face contorted with pain, his body grew, covered in thick fur. He collapsed to his knees, then to the ground, emitting guttural sounds. "Tom!" I shouted, but it was too late. He had turned into a beast. Realizing I was alone, I started to run, but soon felt the changes happening in my own body. A burning sensation shot through my spine. My muscles began to contract uncontrollably. I stumbled and fell to the ground, feeling my hands and feet starting to change. My skin became rough and covered with fur. Bones cracked, lengthening and changing shape. I felt my face elongate, fangs growing. The pain was unbearable, and I emitted inhuman sounds. Every cell in my body screamed in pain, and I realized I could no longer control my movements. My last clear thought was, "I'm no longer human." As I transformed, I saw the man with the skull smirking at me, watching the chaos unfold.